Welcome to my channel. Subscribe to the channel and listen to my stories every day. Lucy and I had always seemed solid. Married for 10 years, with 2 kids and a modest home we'd renovated room by room, our lives were entwined in every way. I trusted her completely, and we had a rhythm. I worked in IT, a steady, if unexciting job, while she had a customer relations role that required charm more than any technical skill. I never fully understood what customer ambassador meant, but I knew she had a way with people. But lately, things had changed. Lucy seemed distracted, almost restless. There were more late nights at the office, more business trips with vague explanations, and more cold silences where there used to be laughter. I'd noticed her subtle glow whenever her phone buzzed, and each time she brushed it off as just work. But this weekend, that sense of unease settled like a stone in my gut. When our firm's CEO, Jack, had invited us to a weekend getaway at a private estate, it seemed like a good distraction from the daily grind. Our host was William Fellows, one of the company's top clients, a man Lucy managed professionally. She'd been his contact at the firm for over a year now, and though I'd never met him, I'd heard enough. The guy was one of those inherited money types, the kind who seemed to glide through life without the worries most people faced. He was charming, according to Lucy, but arrogant in that way only the truly rich could afford to be. Still, the invitation came with the allure of an exclusive weekend on a private island, an opportunity that felt impossible to turn down. Lucy was thrilled. I caught her glancing at herself in the mirror, debating which dress to pack, and I saw a flash of excitement I hadn't seen in a long time. She was eager, maybe a bit too eager, but I shrugged it off as the thrill of luxury. The island estate was breathtaking. I'd seen plenty of nice places over the years, but this was on another level. Acres of lush, manicured grounds stretched out as far as I could see, and the main house overlooked a crescent-shaped beach that looked like something out of a postcard. There were a few other couples there, all senior members of the firm, and I found myself feeling like an outsider, the IT guy tagging along on a trip meant for high-stakes dealmakers. When William finally appeared to greet us, I immediately understood Lucy's fascination. He was every bit the picture of a suave, self-assured host, with that effortless charm that felt both welcoming and intimidating. He greeted everyone with a warm handshake, but with Lucy, there was something more, a familiarity that lingered in the way he placed his hand on her back, the way their laughter mingled a beat too long. We spent the first afternoon lounging by the pool, taking in the sun and savoring the endless supply of cocktails. Lucy, glowing in a way I hadn't seen in years, spent most of her time with William, laughing at his jokes and hanging on his every word. I tried not to let it bother me. After all, she was just being friendly, wasn't she? Dinner was served on a grand terrace overlooking the ocean. The sunset cast a warm, golden glow over the table, and as the wine flowed, so did the conversation. I was halfway through my second glass when William raised his glass to Lucy, toasting her dedication to the company and to new ventures. Everyone laughed, though the words felt strangely loaded. As the laughter died down, William leaned back in his chair, eyeing me with that practiced gaze I'd come to associate with men who rarely took no for an answer. "Mark," he began, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, "I'd like to make you a proposition." His tone was casual, as though he were offering me a drink, not changing the course of my life. I straightened, taken aback. "A proposition?" He nodded, casting a glance at Lucy, who looked suddenly tense. "You see, I've had the pleasure of working closely with Lucy over the past year. She's been invaluable to our company. And, frankly, I'd like to continue that relationship, at least for the remainder of this weekend." The table fell silent. For a moment, I thought it was a joke, that William was just testing the waters to see how far he could push. But his expression was serious, and so was Lucy's. My heart started pounding, the uncomfortable feeling of something unspoken finally coming to light. "What exactly are you saying?" I asked, my voice low. William leaned forward, his eyes locked on mine. I'm saying I'd like to have Lucy's company for the weekend. Just her and me, no work, no obligations. In exchange, I'm willing to wire $100,000 to your joint account. Think of it as compensation for the time she'd be away from you. I looked at Lucy, expecting her to laugh it off, to tell him he'd crossed a line. But she looked away, biting her lip in a way that told me this wasn't the first time she'd considered it. She didn't look horrified or shocked, she looked conflicted. The room felt like it was closing in on me, the air thick with something that tasted like betrayal. I tried to breathe, to make sense of what was happening, but all I could think was how much of a stranger she suddenly felt. Lucy, is this something you want? I managed to choke out. She looked at me then, and I saw something in her eyes I hadn't noticed before, a longing, a desire for something that wasn't me, something I couldn't give her. And yet, in that moment, she still had the audacity to pretend this was about us, that this was somehow for our benefit. Mark, she began, her voice steady but soft, it's just a weekend. It doesn't mean anything. And think of what this could do for us, for our future. I stared at her, unable to process the words coming out of her mouth. She was trying to make this sound reasonable, as if she weren't throwing away everything we'd built together for a weekend with a man who could toss $100,000 around like it was pocket change. For a long, tense moment, no one spoke. The other couples had fallen silent, their gazes averted, clearly uncomfortable with the scene unfolding in front of them. But William remained unruffled, a smug smile playing on his lips as he watched me wrestle with the decision he'd so casually laid before me. And in that silence, I made my choice. I forced myself to smile, to nod as though I understood, as though I could ever truly be okay with what she was about to do. All right, I said, my voice steady despite the rage simmering beneath. If that's what you both want, go ahead. Have your weekend. I could see the flicker of relief in Lucy's eyes, but there was something else, too, a hint of regret, or perhaps guilt. But she said nothing, only nodded, as though she were grateful for my understanding. As if I were somehow complicit in her betrayal. I excused myself, pushing back my chair and stepping away from the table. I needed air, needed to be away from that room, from their glances and their silent judgments. As I walked toward the beach, the realization settled over me, cold and unyielding, the life I thought I knew was over. The woman I thought I loved was gone, replaced by someone who could be bought and sold without a second thought. I spent the night on the beach, letting the waves drown out my thoughts, the salt air stinging my skin as I tried to make sense of it all. By the time the first light crept over the horizon, I knew what I had to do. This wouldn't be the end of me. The morning sunlight poured through the windows as I returned to the estate, my steps deliberate, thoughts steady. I hadn't slept at all, yet I felt more awake, more aware, than I had in years. That night on the beach, I'd faced the reality of my life, the truth about the woman I had loved. My resolve was steeled. If she wanted to be with him, I would let her. But it would come at a cost she hadn't considered. As I approached the house, I saw Lucy laughing with William on the patio. She looked radiant in a way I'd seen a few times when we were younger, back when she thought our future was filled with endless possibilities. It stung to realize she now looked at another man with that same excitement. I swallowed the pain, forcing myself to watch them with cold detachment. I walked up to them, nodding at William in greeting, then turned to Lucy. "I'll be heading out for a bit," I said, my tone casual, as though I hadn't spent the night wrestling with what she'd become. "I want to take a look at some of the trails on the island. Get a little alone time, you know." Lucy hesitated, searching my face, but I kept my expression neutral. She nodded, maybe a bit too eagerly, and I wondered if she was relieved or simply didn't care. "Of course," she said, her tone light. "I'll see you later, then." I nodded, my mouth twisting into a half-smile, though it felt wrong on my face. "Yeah, I'll see you later." As I walked away, I heard them laugh behind me, their voices mixing with the gentle breeze. I took a deep breath and kept moving, allowing the ache in my chest to fade into numbness. Instead of heading toward the trails, I took out my phone and dialed my lawyer's number. It rang only once before he picked up. "Carl," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I'm going to need you to start drafting up divorce papers." There was a pause on the other end before Carl responded, his voice cautious. "Mark, this is sudden. Are you sure about this?" I clenched my jaw, my gaze fixed on the ocean stretching out before me. "Yeah, I'm sure. I want everything handled discreetly. Lucy won't see this coming, so I need it clean, swift. Let's make sure I keep the house, and I don't want her walking away with a cent more than she deserves." Carl agreed, though I could sense the questions he held back. "I'll start on it right away. You'll have the initial paperwork by Monday." I hung up, slipping the phone back into my pocket. The bitterness in my stomach faded, replaced by a cool sense of purpose. If she thought this weekend would be some grand escape from our life, I would make sure it was her final one. I spent most of the day exploring the island, trying to calm the storm in my mind. As afternoon melted into evening, I returned to the estate, feeling calmer, collected. I was ready to face her. Ready to watch her make her choice, knowing she had no idea what was coming. Dinner that night was even more surreal than the night before. William sat at the head of the table, looking every bit the magnanimous host. He poured wine for Lucy, his hand lingering on hers, a silent message that everyone at the table picked up on. I felt a flash of anger but suppressed it, instead lifting my own glass and sipping slowly, letting the silence stretch around us. Lucy glanced at me, perhaps sensing something different in my demeanor, but I gave nothing away. The others at the table shifted uncomfortably, their conversation stilted, aware of the tension hanging in the air. I kept to myself, barely speaking, keeping my eyes on William and Lucy, letting them live out this fantasy of theirs, pretending I didn't exist. Finally, William cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "Mark, I wanted to thank you for your understanding," he said, choosing his words carefully. "It's rare to find someone who's so open-minded." I met his gaze, forcing a smile. "Of course," I replied smoothly. "Anything to keep the business happy." He raised his glass, a silent toast. I clinked mine with his, keeping my grip firm, letting him know without words that I was no pushover. He smiled back, unfazed, as if we'd made some kind of gentleman's agreement. And maybe, in a way, we had. As dinner wrapped up, Lucy caught my eye, her expression filled with uncertainty. She seemed to be waiting for me to do something, to say something that would let her off the hook. But I only gave her a nod, forcing myself to maintain a calm mask as she left the table with William, her steps hesitant but determined. I watched them go, waiting until they were out of sight before I rose from my chair and stepped outside onto the terrace, needing air to clear my head. The others at the table avoided my gaze, their discomfort palpable. I took a deep breath, staring out over the darkened ocean, letting the cool night air steady me. Time passed slowly as I stood there, the night pressing in around me. I tried not to think about what was happening in that house, tried to push away the image of Lucy and William together. Instead, I focused on the plans I'd set in motion, the life I would build without her, the freedom I'd regain once this nightmare was over. After what felt like hours, I turned back to the house, steeling myself for whatever came next. As I stepped inside, I saw Lucy coming down the hallway, her face pale, her eyes darting away from mine. She looked like a stranger, someone I barely recognized. She stopped in front of me, her hands twisting nervously. "Mark," she whispered, her voice shaky. "Can we talk?" I felt the weight of the moment settle over us, but I forced myself to remain calm. "Sure," I said, gesturing for her to follow me. We made our way to a quiet sitting room, the silence between us heavy. Once we were alone, she turned to me, her expression a mixture of guilt and defiance. She hesitated, searching for words. "I wanted to make sure you're okay with this." "Why wouldn't I be?" I replied, my voice steady. You seemed pretty set on this, Lucy. She bit her lip, her gaze dropping to the floor. It's not like that, Mark. I just thought, this could help us. Help me. I thought you'd understand. I laughed, a bitter sound that filled the room. Understand what? That you'd throw away our marriage for a weekend with a man who can pay for the privilege. How noble of you. Her face fell, the color draining from her cheeks. Mark, it's not. I didn't mean for it to be like this. Then what did you mean, Lucy? Enlighten me. I crossed my arms, watching her struggle, waiting for some hint of remorse, some glimmer of the woman I used to love. She hesitated, her expression shifting from guilt to anger. You don't know what it's like, Mark. You don't know how it feels to be wanted, to feel alive. I'm sorry if that hurts you, but it's the truth. I stared at her, stunned by the bluntness of her words. So, this was all about you, then. About your need to feel alive. I shook my head, unable to hide the bitterness in my voice. And here I thought this was supposed to be about us. She turned away, her shoulders tense. I thought you'd support me, Mark. I thought we were a team. A team? I scoffed. Lucy, you stopped being my teammate the moment you agreed to this. You stopped the moment you let him make this offer. She closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. I didn't. I didn't realize it would hurt you this much. Didn't you? I whispered, feeling the last threads of my patience snap. Or did you just not care? She didn't answer, her silence a bitter confirmation of everything I'd suspected. I turned away, unable to look at her any longer. This is the last time you'll have to worry about my feelings, Lucy. Enjoy your freedom while it lasts. With that, I left her standing in the dimly lit room, her face a portrait of regret and something else, a hint of fear, perhaps, as she realized what her choices would cost her. And as I walked away, the weight of finality settled over me. There was no going back now. She had made her choice, and I had made mine. The life we had shared was over, and whatever came next, I was ready to face it, alone. I left her standing there in the shadowy room, a hollow ache in my chest that I knew wouldn't go away anytime soon. But I had come to terms with it. As I walked down the hallway, the walls seemed to close in, pressing in on this life we'd built together, this life she'd now thrown away. I needed air, space, and most of all, a clean break from this place. From her. I spent the night in a guest suite on the far side of the estate, far from the warmth and luxury of the master rooms where William and Lucy stayed. It was a room nobody cared about, barely furnished, as if forgotten. I could hear the faint sound of the waves, an odd comfort in the quiet of the night. I tried to sleep, but my mind kept racing back to the memory of her face when she'd said she felt alive with him. That our marriage had somehow dulled her into something she couldn't bear to be. Maybe I'd let things become routine, maybe I'd gotten comfortable, but I'd never strayed, never entertained anything outside of us. I'd kept my promises, never looking at another woman, never thinking that I wasn't fulfilled. I gave everything to this marriage. And here she was, throwing it away, for what? A spark? A fantasy? I felt the anger return, but now it was colder, tempered by exhaustion. I'd decided on my next steps, but there was a certain satisfaction I still wanted, something that felt unfinished. The next morning, I went down early, before anyone else had risen. The dining room was empty, a lone housekeeper setting out silverware with silent precision. She glanced up, surprised to see me, then nodded politely, her expression neutral. I returned the nod and moved outside to the terrace, wanting the fresh air to settle my mind. I had just settled into the quiet of the morning when I heard footsteps behind me. Turning, I saw William approaching, his gait relaxed, that smug smile still resting on his lips. He held a cup of coffee, as if he were out for a leisurely morning stroll. He nodded at me, not a hint of discomfort or tension in his face. The audacity of it was staggering. "Mark," he greeted, as if nothing were amiss. "Good morning. Sleep well?" I managed a nod, though my jaw clenched. "Slept just fine." He took a seat across from me, crossing his legs, clearly unbothered. "It's a beautiful place, isn't it? I find it quite rejuvenating." He sipped his coffee, watching me over the rim of his cup, as if gauging my reaction. I nodded, playing along. "Sure, it's peaceful." William set his coffee down, studying me with that coldly curious expression I'd come to associate with him. "You know, Mark, I wasn't expecting this level of understanding from you. It's a rare quality in a man. So many men, they get possessive, jealous. It's quite refreshing to see someone with an open mind." My fist tightened under the table, but I kept my expression calm, forcing myself to smile. "Oh, I wouldn't say I'm open-minded, William. Just realistic." He raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Realistic?" I leaned forward, meeting his gaze with a steadiness that I hoped betrayed none of my true feelings. "Yeah. I know what kind of man you are, and I know exactly what you want. You're used to getting what you want, aren't you?" William chuckled, clearly amused. "I suppose you could say that. I found life is easier that way." I held his gaze, the words coming out with more calm than I felt. "So what happens when something doesn't go your way? When someone decides they're not for sale?" The amusement in his eyes flickered, but he quickly recovered, that practiced mask of confidence slipping back into place. "I don't often encounter that problem. And besides, everything has its price, don't you think?" I looked out over the terrace, letting his words linger. "Maybe. But sometimes the price is a lot higher than you're prepared to pay." William studied me, and for the first time, I saw a trace of uncertainty in his gaze, a crack in that armor of his. "Mark, we're both adults here. I'd like to think we understand each other." "Oh, we do," I said, leaning back, feeling a new sense of clarity. "And that's why I'm giving you this advice. Enjoy your time with her, William. Really soak it in. Because this is the only time you'll get it." His eyes narrowed, the mask slipping further. He opened his mouth to respond, but I cut him off. "You see, William, once this weekend is over, she's going to realize something." I let the words hang for a moment, letting the silence work its way under his skin. "She's going to realize that the life she traded for this fantasy was worth a hell of a lot more than you could ever give her." William leaned back, crossing his arms, his expression hardening. "And what makes you so sure of that?" I met his gaze, holding it without flinching. "Because I know Lucy better than you ever could. And when she wakes up from this little dream, she'll be standing alone in a life she can't escape. But by then, it'll be too late." He scoffed, his face twisting with disdain. "That sounds like the bitterness of a man who's lost control. You're right about one thing, Mark, I do get what I want. And right now, I want her." I gave him a half-smile, the kind that held no warmth. "Keep telling yourself that, William. But when reality hits, I think you'll find that the price you paid wasn't worth it." He scoffed, rising from his chair, his posture brimming with the arrogance I'd come to expect. "Well, I suppose we'll just have to see about that." He turned and walked away, his footsteps fading as he disappeared into the house. I watched him go, my anger simmering, but beneath it, a sense of satisfaction began to take hold. He thought he'd won. He thought he'd beaten me. But he had no idea what was coming. The weekend passed in a blur, each hour weighing on me, testing my patience as I waited for it all to be over. I kept to myself, avoiding Lucy as much as possible, letting her enjoy her fleeting fantasy. By the time Sunday evening arrived, I was ready to leave, to put this entire nightmare behind me. I had the papers in my bag, signed and ready to file, and the sight of her with him only strengthened my resolve. When we returned home, she seemed different. Her face was flushed, her eyes bright, as if she'd been rejuvenated by the weekend. She kept sneaking glances at me, almost as if she expected me to say something, to confront her, but I stayed silent, playing the part she'd given me. I could feel her unease growing, a flicker of doubt starting to shadow her gaze. That night, as we settled into bed, she finally spoke. "Mark, are we okay?" Her voice was tentative, unsure, and I could see the fear creeping in. I turned to her, my expression calm, detached. "Why wouldn't we be?" She swallowed, fidgeting with the blanket. "It's just. I feel like things are different. Like. I don't know, like you're distant." I looked at her, forcing myself to hold her gaze, to let her see the finality in my eyes. "Things are different, Lucy. Very different." She froze, her face paling as she realized the weight of my words. What do you mean?" I reached into the drawer beside the bed, pulling out the envelope with the divorce papers. I handed it to her, watching her face as she took it, her hands trembling. "Mark," she whispered, her voice breaking. You're serious?" I nodded, keeping my expression steady. "Yes, Lucy. I'm done." She opened the envelope, her eyes scanning the papers, her face crumbling as the reality hit her. But I thought you understood." "I thought." "What?" "That I'd just let you walk all over me. That I'd stand by and watch you throw everything away for a weekend with him." My voice was calm, but I could feel the bitterness seeping through. Tears filled her eyes, her hands clutching the papers. "Mark, please." I was confused. I didn't realize what I was doing. I laughed, a hollow sound that held no joy. "No, Lucy. You knew exactly what you were doing. And now, you can live with it." She reached for me, her fingers trembling. "Please, Mark. I'm sorry. I didn't mean. I thought it would help us, I thought." "Stop." I held up a hand, cutting her off. "This isn't something you can apologize for, Lucy. You made your choice. And now I'm making mine." Her face crumpled, a sob escaping her lips as she clutched the papers to her chest. I watched her, feeling nothing but a cold sense of satisfaction as she realized what her actions had cost her. And as I left the room, leaving her alone with the ruins of what she'd destroyed, I knew I'd finally reclaimed my life. In the days that followed, I kept to the spare bedroom, my bags packed as I waited for the paperwork to finalize. The house felt strange, like the air had shifted, growing heavier with each passing hour. I could hear Lucy moving around in the master bedroom, the creak of the bed frame as she sat alone, the soft sounds of her crying when she thought I couldn't hear. But I stayed silent, resolute, keeping my distance. I wanted this clean break, and after what she'd done, I was determined to see it through. By the end of the week, Carl confirmed that everything was in motion. All that was left now was my signature on the final document, and I would be free. Free from the lies, the heartbreak, and the betrayal that had shattered my life. But as the day drew closer, I felt a strange weight settle over me, a heaviness I hadn't expected. It was one thing to imagine a new life, another to face the silence of the empty house and know it was forever. I found myself wandering the house that last evening, my footsteps echoing through rooms that had once been filled with laughter and warmth. Each room held a memory, trivial moments, laughter shared, conversations whispered in the dark. It felt as though I were walking through a graveyard of the life I'd built, saying goodbye to each piece of it. I stepped into our bedroom, now stripped of any personal touches, and found Lucy sitting by the window, her figure silhouetted against the fading light. She looked up as I entered, her eyes red, cheeks pale. She held the divorce papers in her hands, her fingers trembling as she looked down at them, then back at me. "Mark," she whispered, her voice so soft it was almost lost in the quiet. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to fix this. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. I felt tired, worn down by the weight of everything. There's nothing to say, Lucy. It's done. You made your choice. She closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks as she took a shuddering breath. I know. I didn't realize how much I was losing until it was too late. I watched her, feeling the anger melt away, replaced by a dull ache, a sadness I hadn't expected. Lucy, I don't understand why you did it. We had a good life. Was it not enough? She shook her head, her eyes filling with regret. It was, Mark. It was more than enough. I lost myself somewhere along the way. I got caught up in something that wasn't real, and now, her voice trailed off, and she looked down at the papers in her hands, her fingers tracing the edges as though they were fragile. I looked away, unable to bear the sight of her grief. Maybe we just weren't meant to last. Maybe it was always going to end this way. She looked up at me, a glimmer of hope in her eyes, as if searching for some sign that I might change my mind. But I couldn't. Too much had happened, and I knew that going back would only trap us both in a cycle of pain and regret. She reached out, her fingers brushing against mine, and for a brief moment, I felt the familiar warmth of her touch. I almost pulled away, but something held me there, a flicker of the love we'd once shared, a memory that refused to die. Mark, please, she whispered, her voice breaking. If there's anything left, anything at all, please don't go. I looked at her, my heart twisting as I saw the raw vulnerability in her eyes. But I knew it wasn't enough. Whatever we'd had, it was gone, lost in the choices we'd both made. And there was no bringing it back. I'm sorry, Lucy, I said, my voice barely audible. But I can't stay. Not after this. Her face crumpled, a broken sob escaping her lips as she clutched the papers to her chest. I stood there, feeling like a stranger in my own life, watching the woman I'd once loved unravel before me. But I forced myself to turn away, to walk out of that room and leave the past behind. As I reached the door, I heard her whisper, "Goodbye, Mark." And in that moment, it felt like the final thread of our life together had snapped, severing us forever. I drove away that night, the road stretching out before me, empty and dark. I felt a strange sense of freedom, but it was laced with an overwhelming sadness, a grief that settled deep within me, refusing to let go. Weeks passed, and I threw myself into work, filling my days with tasks and routines to keep the loneliness at bay. I moved into a small apartment downtown, leaving the house to Lucy. It felt easier that way, like a clean break, a fresh start. But as the days turned into months, I felt the emptiness grow, a hollow ache that no amount of distraction could fill. One night, as I sat alone in my apartment, the phone rang, the sound jarring in the silence. I picked it up, half expecting it to be a wrong number, but when I heard Carl's voice on the other end, my heart sank. "Mark. I don't know how to say this," he began, his voice heavy with emotion. "It's about Lucy." A chill ran through me, and I gripped the phone, my knuckles white. What happened?" He hesitated, his silence more telling than words. She's gone, Mark. They found her in the house. It looks like she overdosed." The room spun, my mind reeling as I tried to process his words. I felt as though the floor had dropped out from under me, leaving me suspended in a void of disbelief and pain. "No," I whispered, barely able to breathe. That can't be true." "I'm sorry, Mark," Carl said, his voice filled with sorrow. "I thought you should know." I hung up, the phone slipping from my hand as I sank to the floor, the weight of the loss crashing over me in waves. All the anger, the betrayal, the pain, it all dissolved, leaving only a crushing emptiness. She was gone, and no matter how much I wanted to turn back, to reach out, to undo the choices we'd made, it was too late. The days that followed were a blur, a haze of grief and regret that consumed me. I attended her funeral, standing alone among faces that were as empty as I felt. I watched as they lowered her casket into the ground, feeling the finality of it settle over me like a shroud. As I left the cemetery, I felt a strange sense of peace, but it was laced with a sadness that would never fade. Lucy was gone, and with her, the life we'd shared, the memories we'd built, the love we'd once held so tightly. And I knew, as I walked away from that place, that I would carry that loss with me forever. In the end, there was no revenge, no satisfaction, no justice. Only the quiet, aching reminder of what we had lost, a ghost that would haunt me for the rest of my days.